This is the Tree of Life, Season 4, Chapter 7. In this episode, we will be talking about the process by which an individual becomes spatial non-consensual leading up to the flipping of the telescopic effect. To start out, individuals who are archetypal consensual, interacting, represent the interplay of 9 narratives of affirmation corresponding to 9 impulses. These individuals exist within the conjoint consensuality, which is to say, their intersections are points of consensus between the expectations corresponding to those 9 narratives. However, when an individual who is archetypal consensual interacts with another individual, they have the capacity to negate any one of those impulses. The result of said negation is the creation of a dissonant consensuality. That is, a historical narrative or experience channel which does not reflect their action or experience within the consensus conjoined consensuality. This dissonant consensuality, by consequence of othering, generates spatial non-consensuality through the association of that segregated history with some historical narrative. Which is to say, that spatial non-consensual actors are generally described by some historical narrative which departs from consensus. Now, this lost narrative of history can be reincorporated into the conjoined consensuality through interaction with an archetypal consensual actor in the act of sublimation by that archetypal consensual actor. Which is to say, that in the interaction between the spatial non-consensual actor, in the deferral of their expectations, through the contact point of an archetypal consensual actor, the conjoined consensuality as a whole is agitated. To put it another way, imagine that the conjoined consensuality possesses an intrinsic quality of intersection between social actors, which represents the frequency of consensus, or nodal points within the conjoined consensuality. These intersections typically represent points at which their impulses are affirmed according to the intersection of 9 narratives forging the consensus out of those narratives. Now, this intrinsic quality of intersection within the conjoined consensuality represents something quantifiable. It is a quantity as opposed to a quality. Which is to say, that when a spatial non-consensual actor causes sublimation of an archetypal consensual actor, the result is the agitation of the conjoined consensuality. Just as agitating a body of water causes the water to flow back and forth. Now, once in the state of spatial non-consensuality, generated in response to othering and the association with a lost historical narrative, the individual has 3 options as to how they can act subsequently. 1. They can through their othering self-identify with the outgroup. Thereby, by extension of that choice, creating a new line as a spatial non-consensual actor within an archetypal consensual line. 2. They can reintegrate into a historical lineal line as an archetypal consensual actor. 3. They can reintegrate within the originating archetypal consensual line as a result of deference, further to resolution by enforcement. In other words, with respect to the first option, they can incorporate their lost history into a competing narrative, which is not necessarily dominant within the archetypal consensuality as consensus. Now, to return to the agitation of the conjoined consensuality through sublimation in response to the spatial non-consensual actor, what we can see is that sublimation, by consequence of the loosening of the associations of the archetypal consensual actor in the verbalizations, produces this agitation within the conjoined consensuality. Which is to say that since we know that negation in response to a social intersection produces asynchronization and loss of synchronicity, as between those 2 interacting actors, the reintegration of the spatial non-consensual actor involves an increase in the frequency of intersections within the conjoined consensuality. Thus, we can see that the concept of flipping the telescopic effect involves the direct modulation of the frequency of spatial intersections amongst the conjoined consensuality, and thus a direct impact not on the nature of the consensus, but upon the frequency of it. That's the end of the podcast for today.